Grace and peace to you from the one who was and is to come. Amen. When family shows up, it can mean two things. It can have a negative connotation. Someone complains about relatives who have arrived without an invitation or prior notice. Their sudden arrival is considered disruptive to one's schedule and disrespectful of one's privacy. Unannounced drop-ins signal a boundary issue. But the phrase, when family shows up, can also have a positive meaning and express gratitude for much needed support and solidarity in an emergency. We are reassured that we're not alone. In today's biblical episode, Jesus' family does indeed suddenly show up. The usual translations and interpretations cast Jesus' mother Mary as an unannounced and disruptive drop-in, who has no understanding of the urgency of his mission. But there are other ways of translating and reading the passage, forcing us to revisit and probe what appears to be some form of prejudice towards Mary. What if Mary shows up not to disrupt, but to express support and solidarity? After all, what was the relationship between Mary and Jesus like? Was it really Mary who at some stage believed that her son was out of his mind? Did she try to take him home and bring him back to his senses? There are scholars who encourage us to have a second look at the biblical evidence. It matters how we envisage this mother and son relationship. When Mary and her grown-up children suddenly show up, do they really try to hold Jesus back because they think that he's gone too far? And Jesus really rebuke his mother and siblings, distancing himself from them by adopting his followers as his new family? A lot is at stake in how we imagine this significant scene in Mark's Gospel. I'm following the translation of Lucia Suter-Rehmann, which sets a different tone from the usual translations. And because they said he had an unclean spirit, his mother and his brothers and sisters came. They stood outside so that he would be released, and they called for him. And since a crowd was sitting around him, they said to him, "Look, your mother and your sisters and brothers outside are asking for you." He answered them and said, "Who is my mother and my brothers and sisters?" And he looked at those sitting around him and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers and sisters. Whoever does the will of God is brother and sister and mother to me." The common interpretation of this episode suggests a family conflict. But a close reading and examination of the ancient Greek text opens up new ways of translating and reading the text, which add greater coherence to the gospel narrative as a whole. I'm following the lead of the feminist scholar Lucia Suter-Rehmann. At times, a different translation of a single Greek word can function like a nutcracker, opening up new perspectives. New ways of picturing the scene arise in our imagination, illuminating the relationship between Mary and Jesus in unexpected ways. A liberation theology perspective urges us to keep the socio-political context of oppression in mind. We need to remain sensitive to the distress and suffering of those affected by violent occupation, hunger, and exploitation. One's own privilege, status, and wealth can blind one to the harsh socio-political realities in the text. There's always the danger of spiritualizing the gospel stories, neglecting the material reality of war, poverty, and hunger. We notice that Jesus' mother and siblings are mentioned 5 times in this passage. This is a lot. The focus of the scene is clearly on Jesus' family, their deep concern for the well-being of Jesus. Joseph is absent while Mary is driven by a deep care and devotion for her son. She's supported by her other children who show up in solidarity with their mother. Notice the difference between the conventional translation and the one suggested by Sutta Rehman. The traditional translation reads, "Then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him." The alternative translation reads, "His mother and his brothers and sisters came. They stood outside so that he would be released, and they called for him." The alternative translation creates a very different mood. Mary and her children are standing outside calling for Jesus so that he would be released. They're calling out loudly in the street because they cannot get to him. Jesus, on the other hand, seems to be held somewhere against his will. Instead of sending someone in, they are said to call out so that he may be released. The Greek word apostolein can mean both to send forth or to let someone go or be released. In the latter case, someone is holding Jesus back against his will, while his family is demanding his immediate release. In other words, Jesus is somehow held a prisoner, and his mother and siblings are looking for him. This reading of our scene is not just based on our alternative translation of the one verb, but it provides a first opening for another way of understanding the whole episode. When we consider the bigger context, we would, for example, have to ask, why are his mother, sisters, and brothers suddenly showing up? And what do they want from Jesus? Their sudden appearance seems to signal some kind of emergency. But what is at stake, and how did it come to this situation? At the beginning of chapter 3, we hear about Jesus teaching in the synagogue. A few Pharisees and some followers of Herod start plotting how they might kill Jesus. We have to take this threat to Jesus' life seriously. And even though we then read about Jesus withdrawing to the lake and then moving to the mountains, and then appointing his 12 disciples, the threat to his life is always present. We continue to read about his work among the poor, who don't even have bread to eat. Jesus ministers to people in great distress. Those in power seem to feel threatened by the support Jesus receives from the hungry masses who are ready to gather and protest against an unjust and exploitative system. At this point, just before we come to our episode, our Bible translations usually read, "When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him or arrest him, for they said he's out of his mind." But why does his family suddenly show up? And why would his family want to seize Jesus by force? The verb could also be translated as wanting to arrest him. And it is also the same verb used to describe John's arrest and imprisonment. And the same verb is used later to describe Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, when the soldiers seize him by force and against his will. Something does not quite add up. Why would his family want to seize him by force? And why should they think that he's out of his mind? A closer look at the Greek text reveals that the word family or relatives is not even mentioned in the text. It simply says those around him. When those around him heard about this, they went to arrest him, for they said he's out of his mind. It is not a clearly defined group, except that we're told that they're trying to arrest Jesus because they think that he's out of his mind. A group of people around Jesus want to grab him by force and detain him. It is an intense situation, and all of this happens at the very moment that the hungry crowd comes into view. Do those in power regard Jesus' concern for the hungry and poor as a form of agitation, potentially developing into an open revolt? This reading stands in stark contrast to the common translations which suggest a family conflict in which Jesus' relatives are trying to take him back home because they think he's going mad. What we rather notice is that Herod's security police, who had been after Jesus for quite a while, is ready to seize and detain him. These armed special forces are among the crowd surrounding Jesus, always close to him, waiting for the opportune moment to arrest him. What we notice is that in Mark's Gospel, Jesus is being followed and persecuted from the very beginning of his ministry. In fact, in Matthew's Gospel, for example, Jesus' life is under threat from the day of his birth. Remember how Herod's henchmen are looking for the newborn in the infancy narratives. Again and again in the Gospel mentions that Jesus is followed and carefully watched. But we tend to miss those details, not recognizing how real and constant the threat of arrest is. His solidarity with the poor and hungry was seen as a threat by both the religious and political establishment. Large crowds were gathering around him because they had no bread to eat, and Jesus was willing to witness their severe living conditions and help articulate their deeper despair about Rome's exploitative rule. Jesus encouraged the poor and hungry to stand up for the daily bread. It is an aspect that made it even into the one prayer he taught his disciples: "Give us today our daily bread." To those in power, the request for bread is not innocent, but a first sign of political resistance. This is also why only the Roman emperor was officially allowed to stage a mass feeding. It becomes clear that Herod had his spies and security police on the ground. Any kind of criticism of the status quo had to be silenced immediately. According to Herod's security police, the reasons for Jesus' arrest is that he's out of his mind. To declare someone mad is a convenient justification for detainment, but in what ways will Jesus have been beside himself? Did his anger about people starving lead to a rage against the religious and political elite? Or was he losing his mind over the pain and misery of his people? The text remains silent about it. Herod's security police did not have to have any concrete reasons for his arrest. They will have accused him of being a troublemaker and agitator. He will have been declared to be a danger to the public peace. And with his detainment, they had the right to interrogate and, if necessary, torture him. We now also hear about scribes having come down from Jerusalem. Their task will have been to document the verdict, the sentence, and the witnesses. These scribes accused Jesus of being possessed by Beelzebub. The name called to mind a conflict between King Ahaziah and the prophet Elijah. This time Jesus was the one accused of aligning himself with a foreign deity from a neighboring country. It is a connection that allowed them to accuse Jesus of serving a foreign power, acting as a secret agent in the name of a power hostile to the state. We've heard such rhetoric before, of course, a convenient and easy way to discredit someone and target him as an enemy of the state. At the end of the interrogation, Jesus seems to be really unwell. And because they said he had an unclean spirit, his mother and his brothers and sisters came. We cannot be sure who it was who said that Jesus had an unclean spirit. Yet what is striking is that Jesus' mother and siblings immediately hurry to him. For them, the claim that Jesus has an unclean spirit is a signal to drop everything and come to his side. He who is always there for others now needs his family to be there for him. They are ready to stand up for him. We witness such immediate action with the Syro-Phoenician mother in Tyre and her daughter. We also read about a father desperate to help his son, who keeps throwing himself into fire or water. What these stories from Mark's Gospel illustrate is that families take immediate action when one of their children has an unclean spirit. And in Mark's Gospel, having such an unclean spirit is very different from being possessed by a demon. Those affected by such a spirit are in danger of harming or hurting themselves. One wonders what happened to them, what led to their spirit, their pneuma, their life force to be seriously diminished and weakened. The context of violence and hunger has put their lives at risk and will have deeply traumatized them. But Jesus did not hesitate to challenge those unclean spirits, believing that the children's life force can be cleansed, transformed, strengthened, and renewed. In our episode, Jesus is said to have an unclean spirit himself. He is at a low point in his life. He has been arrested along with others. We know that they were scheming to kill him. His family must have sensed that this is an emergency situation. Unclean spirit does not just refer to an illness, but to a spiritual, existential affliction, a despair which might very well have physical effects. Was it an indication of Jesus being exhausted, tired to the point of death? Was this possibly the result of his detainment and interrogation? What happened to him to suddenly be close to death? Was he beaten and tortured? Did he lose the will to live? Is he lying somewhere on the ground? What have they done to him? But there is a small ray of hope. They stood outside so that he would be released, and they called for him. There's a group of people standing outside the building. Mary is not alone. Jesus' sisters and brothers are with her. They are also adults. They are calling out together. They demand to see him. They insist on him being released. They support each other in their outrage and despair. They hope to receive a sign of life from Jesus. Mary's courage and determination echoes the positive association of being a mother or having a mothering role in the Bible. Sutta Rehman suggests that motherhood is regarded as the epitome of social responsibility and protection for the weakest. This understanding of Mary resonates with the way she's portrayed throughout the Gospels. She's held in high esteem from the very beginning of her hearing the words of the angel. Jesus always seems to have had a very good relationship with his mother. And it is Mary who is said to stand at the foot of the cross when Jesus was crucified. And it is Mary who is now taking the initiative to look for Jesus when rumors about his detainment are spreading. She's determined to stand at his side and is asking his siblings to support her. It is daring and risky to stand in the streets and call out the name of someone politically persecuted. They are asking for his release, which presupposes that he was arrested. The conditions of detention were inhumane. Hygienic conditions were catastrophic. There was hardly any food provided. Prisoners had to depend on the support from outside. No wonder that caring for prisoners from early on was regarded an important aspect of Christian compassion. What happened next? It is a moving moment. Those imprisoned with Jesus are making him aware that his mother and siblings are outside calling out for him, standing up for him. And since a crowd was sitting around him, they said to him, "Look, your mother and your sisters and brothers outside are asking for you." It becomes clear that Jesus was not arrested alone. There was a whole crowd with him. Why were they imprisoned? Were they caught stealing bread, or did they too speak up against the injustice they witnessed? Does Jesus now lift his head and hear his name being called? Does he realize that he's not alone in this dark hole or dungeon? Others are looking out for him. They want him to hear the calling of his family. It is at that moment that he looks at those with him and finds the strength to affirm them. He answered them and said, "Who is my mother and my brothers and sisters?" And he looked at those sitting around him and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers and sisters. Whoever does the will of God is brother and sister and mother to me." Jesus is not being critical of his mother and siblings. They are outside calling for him and reaching out to him. They do not consider him to be out of his mind. They are rather distressed by his detainment and worried about his well-being. It is along those lines that the Jewish scholar of religion, Shalom ben Kurin, questions the usual interpretation of Jesus' response as a rebuke. He does not find it believable that Jesus, who was considered a rabbi, would treat his own mother so harshly. There's a tenderness in how they draw Jesus' attention to the call of his mother. It is an expression of solidarity. They are there for each other. They are happy for him that he is not forgotten by his family. And Jesus notices their care. Their solidarity inspires him to affirm them as being like a mother, brother, and sister to him. They've become family in their shared suffering. And in Jesus, they will have recognized someone whose solidarity with the poor and hungry has led to arrest and imprisonment. They were united in doing the will of God, which is to demand justice and bread. What a comfort it must have been to realize that one is not alone in this, and that there's family inside and outside of prison who stand with you. At this very dark moment in his life, Jesus' spirit seems to be lifted again, cleansed from the despair and the fear of death, open to receive the gift of God's kingdom among them, the experience of a profound sense of belonging, of being held by people who become a mother, brother, or sister to him. As we also look for those moments of connection and solidarity, glimpses of the kingdom of God among us, may Christ be in our ears to hear. May Christ be in our eyes to see. May Christ be in our mouth to speak. And may Christ be in our hands to care. Amen.